Alrighty, I think that's a little better. As far as I can tell, I'm actually a moving body now, not just a frozen image on a screen. Kind of maybe relevant for this conversation, though, right? Like, you know, what's real, what images are working, and what can we trust? Is this person alive or dead? Lots to talk about. I'm going to try and find the right segue somehow. So, hi, everybody. My name is Michael Casey. Some of you will know me perhaps as the Chief Content Officer for CoinDesk, author and a journalist over the years, involved in this space for a while. And that is a hat that I'm wearing today. But I'm also wearing, luckily enough, another hat that is, I think, relevant to this conversation that we're about to have, where I'm the non-executive chairman of Streambed that I co-founded some time ago with a very good Canadian, Jenna Pilgrim, the CEO. And so here to talk a little bit about sort of media and blockchain technology. And this is where Streambed comes into that, of course, as well as CoinDesk. So that's me. Let me now introduce to you Kathryn Harrison, the founder and CEO of the Deep Trust Alliance. Kathryn, welcome. And why don't you just tell people what the Deep Trust Alliance is all about, and a little bit about what the core problem is that you are trying to solve.
Absolutely. So the Deep Trust Alliance is a nonprofit focused on fighting the problem of malicious deep fakes. So deep fakes are images, video, or audio that are created using AI technology. Using this technology, you can literally create a picture of someone doing and saying things they've never done before. Now, lots of deep fakes are highly entertaining. Hollywood has been using this technology in different iterations for a long time. And now some of the deep fake filters are available in social media platforms like Snapchat and TikTok. And so what we are really concerned about is when individuals use this type of technology to try and harm either other individuals, organizations, or society at large. One of the biggest problems that we see and that Deep Trust Alliance is focused on is the problem of deep fake porn. And 96% of deep fakes are deep fake porn. And what that means is they take the face or the image of a woman and put it onto a porn video without the consent of either the pornography actresses or the person. You can imagine the harm that this can inflict. So Deep Trust Alliance is pulling together key stakeholders in the ecosystem to think through technology, policy, and education to solve this problem.
Given that you mentioned policy, probably worth asking the question then, clearly some concern going into this election about the capacity for this kind of abuse to feed into the broad problem of disinformation. Did we see any of that during the campaign, and how relevant is this problem to, the political picture?
So this is obviously potential risk in politics and in particular. In this election cycle, we did see a handful of deep fakes, though they were very quickly identified as such. Candidly, cheap fakes, which are manipulated media, which is made with kind of the traditional tools like Photoshop or video editing tools, are still convincing enough that you don't actually need to go to the trouble in most instances of creating an AI version of the deep fake. You can do it with some of the most basic tools that have been around for 20 years. And certainly we've seen, just today there was a video which was president, which had been debunked last week, related to kind of the election and ballot counting. So this is a massive problem, regardless of how the information is created, whether it's with AI or not. Major challenge for politics as well as society at large.
Right, and presumably just going to get harder as the technology gets more and more sophisticated. So tell us, this is a blockchain conference. What role would blockchain play in helping to solve this particular challenge?
Well, it's a great question. I think to take a step back, to figure out if something is really disinformation. That means that it's both fun and there's an intent to harm behind it, right? And so what's really critical is to understand, where does this information originate from? Who created it? How was it created? With what, with what tools, whether it be with what cameras, with what editing tools, so that you can begin to really understand kind of how this content has come to be. And so providing that level of clarity on the provenance, as I said, what camera, to what extent was it edited, where does it get distributed? That's a great use case for blockchain, especially if you don't want one single party to have complete and total control over that information. And there's a number of different projects that are happening, which we can dive into and talk a little bit about. But it's just really critical for people to have more tools and capabilities to understand, where does this information come from? You guys must see this at CoinDesk all the time, right? As you put together stories, you need to make sure you have the right, etc. And there are really valuable ways in which you could potentially use blockchain to solve some of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to dive into some of them myself, to make a bit of two-way here. And ultimately, Streambed Media was created out of the understanding that creators are actually also being undermined by this, right? So the deepfake problem, in some respects, comes from the perspective of the publisher saying, "Can I trust this video that was created by somebody in some way?" And yet the other way is also, I think, kind of really relevant. Can I prove that I own, that I am the creator of this particular video, this particular piece of digital content? So there's a copyright question around that. But I think even more importantly is the challenge of grappling with the core currency of the digital media industry, and that is data. And data, at the moment is siloed and controlled by the big social media platforms that basically dictate, in many respects, what we see, when, and how, right? And they set the terms by which, whatever it is that whether it's on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, basically they're the terms by which your content is viewed. And there is now a complete fragmentation of the data associated with what was ultimately usually just one piece of content, a video that you created. So where we think blockchain is going to be really valuable, and this is really the fundamental role that blockchain plays within Streambed's architecture, is that it has this original source of truth to the content, so that there's my video doing strange things, so that the actual atomic unit around which the conversation of where this thing is going, who's seeing it, what the traffic is not so much the account on social media, but it starts with the content itself. And you need to have this single record of truth that a blockchain-based layer provides, and we're working on top of the Open Index protocol, which works on top of the Flow blockchain, so that you have the capacity to then draw that data trail across everything, right? Independently of the platforms, which we think is truly an empowering thing for creators, no longer kind of beholden to what YouTube wants to say. You can determine these things on your behalf. And if you didn't have a blockchain, because the question always comes up, why blockchain? My view is that the only way you would provide a service is by becoming yet another siloed platform. So if you want to resolve this true problem for creators, we need to have this open, independent index of where everything lies. And then I think what's interesting about that is that then it goes back the other way to where you guys are at, to say, okay, we've established that. How can that be useful for this process of figuring out, is it fake or not? It seems to me though that it's just one piece of the pie for you guys, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of other tools. There's AI tools. There's actually the hardware around the cameras. So talk a little bit about all the other stuff that needs to go into it. I mean, including even, ethics and sort of social standards and things.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I dive into all of that, though, I also want to talk about, you mentioned the creators. Also think about human rights activists or whistleblowers that want to be able to share information. They want to be able to have it be clearly verified but they don't necessarily want to be outed as the source of that information. And that's one of the areas where being able to use privacy protecting technology via blockchain can allow you to really verify, okay, yes, this information is correct. It was taken with this camera in this place. But you can't necessarily out whoever the activist or the whistleblower is. And you can imagine, especially in authoritarian countries, this is critical that you can get the real information, but still protect your sources. And that really goes into the different pieces of it. So there obviously is the need to be able to verify at the hardware level. What's incredible, we all have LiDAR on our smartphones. We have trusted compute environments. And so there are a number of the hardware providers that are looking at how can they actually digitally sign that a photograph has been taken with a specific device, etc. So that's one really interesting and exciting direction that's happening. And I think blockchains are really interesting.
Sorry to interrupt, Kathryn, but like it's really important as well, right? For this garbage in, garbage out problem, right? I mean, you've got to start with that trusted starting point. And so it's often a criticism of these sorts of solutions, where blockchain is involved. People say, well, ultimately the record is going to lie to you if you don't know what's come in. But that's where I think this intersection between these hardware solutions becomes really interesting. It's the starting point. It's the last mile, or the first mile rather, in that trail, in that chain.
Yeah, to be able to have that proof of existence is kind of that first piece, so that you can actually really anchor that chain of custody of the asset and what photograph or a video or music or whatever it might be, so that you can really understand where it originated from and how. And that's one of the challenges in a lot of systems that exist today, is that you, as you said, you start at a certain point, but you either have some assumption of existence. There isn't a lot that kind of provides that proof, and doing it at the hardware level certainly takes some key steps to doing that. So that's kind of one set of things. And the technology, though, as I said, is critical, but it's only one piece of it. The technology is not good or bad in and of itself. I think what's really important is, especially when you think about from the creative lens, there are people doing incredible, cool videos, voices. There's an amazing public service announcement that came out this election season that has Kim Jong-un giving a talk talking about how lucky people in America are to have the vote and how important it is to vote, which is hysterical, obviously, coming from Kim Jong-un. And so it has a very positive message. And it's really critical to look at the intention and the behavior that humans are using rather than simply the technology itself. How is this being used? What is the intent? Because that is so critical. And I think we look at, to the extent that policy is an important part of this, using existing laws where they exist to apply to any kind of bad behavior with deep fakes, and also recognizing that the harms are different when they're digital, and so making adjustments on that front. And then there's also obviously the need for education. For the last 100 years, you could basically trust what you saw on a video or in audio because it was so expensive and so hard to create credible fakes, unless you were going into, the movies or some sovereign governments. But now you have that level of computing power, at your home computer. You can do some of that on your cell phone. And so we really need to adjust how and think about what they're consuming and what do they share and where is it going. That is really critical so that people aren't sharing garbage.
So pick up on what you were saying before about the idea that there are people using these tools for art, for legitimate satire, parody, all those sorts of things, and we really do not want to clamp down on that, right? So we don't want to create a censorship regime out of this, particularly one that would be sort of algorithmic and just basically treats anything that is fake or sort of manipulated in some way as a hammer hitting a nail. Anything, just that's it, it's gone, right? And finding that nuance to me strikes me as really complicated. But especially so if the mechanism for controlling deepfakes is a kind of a centralized one, right? Where it is a platform that's like yes or no. Now, at the moment, that's the way things work. But I like the idea, and we've discussed this, you and I, before. I've seen this in some of the deep trust alliances, whereby there is, along with that education you're talking about, these tools that allow us to make a decision as individuals on whether or not this is, it flags it as a SSL, certification does to the risk of a website not being secure. And I can decide whether or not I want to go into that website or not. And so a similar kind of trail that says, all right, this is a video that for whatever reason doesn't conform to what this technology is interpreting it to be in terms of the provenance of its trail. But you know what? It's up to you. To sort of have that capacity strikes me as, as something that's pretty important in terms of how do we maintain essentially freedom of expression and also freedom of choice on what you can do, but at the same time, give people the tools they need to educate themselves.
100%. I mean, the thing is, the way that we consume media changed from a practical standpoint. We have very few additional indicators to understand where does it come from, who is the producer, what is the intent, etc. And I think that especially given the volume we are now consuming, it's really critical to have indicators that help us to shortcut some of those semantic clues that we need to be able to parse what's real and what's not real. So, in the analog world, you would trust a newspaper or a magazine or perhaps TV, and there were very clear markers of industry trust. Now, often we're scrolling through a Twitter feed before coffee in the morning, and you don't necessarily have the tie to the source information for every single, tweet that you might see or article that gets posted. Twitter's taken some important steps over the last couple of weeks to begin to label and put warnings and blockers when information is sort of clearly intended to mislead or deceive. But there is that's like really they are driving the kind of those policies. And I think there's a real opportunity to help humans better consume information and figure out what they share. I completely agree that, the equivalent of like an SSL lock that shows we have provenance information or here are a few things you should be aware of will help humans as we take in so much information to parse it more accurately. Because so often the reason, there's kind of two reasons that they've done research as to why people share conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation. There's confirmation bias. So if something conforms to what you already think is true, you're much less likely to double check the provenance or try and understand where does it come from because it conforms to your worldview. But the second factor is actually far more important. It's cognitive laziness. We all have so much information that we're trying to parse through every day. We just don't have the time or capacity to try and sort through all of this. And the more that we can give individual decision makers, whether it's like a consumer at home looking at Facebook or an executive at a company trying to understand different security risks, more clues and information to help them make better decisions, the more accurately they're going to be able to do that.
So I'm going to pick up a little bit on this and go somewhere slightly more controversial. And that is, so when you talk about these things, cognitive laziness and confirmation bias and things that are actually, arguably bad forms of human behavior, we want to improve this. I would argue that those flaws are actually built into the business models of large social media platforms. They need us to be falling for this stuff all the time, to retweet, to share, to build, to sort of engage, right? In fact, the advertising models of Facebook have been shown to do this, to create, red feed and blue feed, whatever it is that your bias is toward, precisely so that advertisers can have this sticky audience that's constantly involved in this, echo chamber of conversation around whatever it is, whether it's true or not, right? So there's a real problem here because we have a digital media economy that's essentially geared toward this sort of stuff. On the other hand, would think like big publishers, the New York Times, everyone else, you would think that they would be really interested in trying to establish provenance, to trying to get people to actually, basically read and consume media based on the quality of it, the accuracy of it, right? Rather than the bias. And I've always sort of made this argument that, the biggest problem we face often in mainstream media is that we spend enormous amounts of money, getting to the truth, right? With lawyers and whole, editing teams of people who are making sure that the facts are straight. And you send people off to go and find the story in Iraq or wherever it is. And all that's an incredibly expensive, difficult thing. And yet, under this business model, this platform-driven business model, you're actually being outcompeted by liars because it costs nothing to lie. So this is a really big problem. Like we step back and we've got actually an economic design problem of our entire digital media architecture. So where am I going with this? First of all, Streambit is, we're trying to grapple with this. Like, how do we build a model that allows us to tap the APIs of the separate different publishers, and not necessarily get we're still having to deal with the fact that eyeballs are still in that place. That's where the community is. They want to be where the network effect is. So you really need those platforms in some way. But how at the same time do we create this independent trail that diminishes that control and allows us to build something that is a bigger and stronger statement about the veracity and importance of that media, right? Nonetheless, what we really want is the cooperation of those platforms in this process. So I'm wondering, like, what are you hearing? Because I know you've been out there talking to all sorts of media organizations, publishers, platforms, and others, and whether Google and Facebook or not want to maintain their business model, surely they do have real concerns about being associated with disinformation and what they do about that. So where do things stand, and how important is it that they participate as well as, say, the CNNs and New York Times and Wall Street Journals of this world?
Yeah, so the distribution element of this is critical because actually, if you created tons of deep fakes on your own computer and you just email them to 10 of your friends, it wouldn't really matter, right? The problem is the reach. The problem is the micro-targeting. The problem is the algorithmic amplification. So there are a couple of pieces that I think are important to talk about. So the first question is kind of the business model and the platforms themselves. What we saw over the last couple of weeks with the election is that the friction that was added, which actually kind of ruins the experience or harms the business model of the platforms, was really the only effective thing to begin to slow and stop the spread of misinformation and disinformation. Let's be clear, there still were massive conspiracy groups that started on Facebook. Much of the disinformation that's spread by major political figures continues to be available, but it now is under a warning or a label. That's very important. It's a huge and important set of helpful steps, but it doesn't solve the problem. The other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is that each of us sees a stream of information that is completely tailored and personalized to us based on what we've clicked on, what we've looked at in the past, which makes it extremely difficult to figure out kind of these base levels. So where are the platforms? They know that they need to take important steps. They have taken some of those steps. They still do not provide the level of transparency that's necessary to understand, number one, what's the reach of these posts, because that is really what's critical. How many eyeballs are on this? Who's getting served this content? They have that information. They view it as a proprietary part of their assets, but it is critical to how our society functions. Now, they also have to make sure that they don't put themselves in existential regulatory risk. There's obviously a lot of frustration in Washington and other world capitals about how mis and disinformation can get spread on their platforms. And so they really have a tight tightrope walk that they need to do. I think, the challenge is that we've made all this available for free, basically, for most humans. And so introducing a different business model is going to be extremely challenging unless we have like very real consequences that we see. Either it's set by governments, or kind of the individuals feel directly harmed and abandon the platforms. Candidly, this summer, there were large boycotts of Facebook by a number of advertisers who were frustrated with disinformation and misinformation and hate. And stock price fell 7% when it was first announced, but earnings were through the roof, and it did not impact their bottom line at all. No. So there is a huge set of changes that need to happen in terms of the media if we're going to have a sustainable ecosystem that supports democracy.
Yeah, and you touched on a point about the data being the model, right? I mean, and so ultimately by making it free, what instead we kind of through the back door created as the business model was data as a currency. And that sounds great if we all had equal access to that data, but it's not. It's all centralized. And so it's this idea of owning your own data is an attractive one, but I'm just not quite sure how viable from a truly economic perspective it is. On the other hand, if I do have economies of scale, I have all of that network effect, then that data is extremely valuable. And obviously, if I keep it, it is my secret sauce, right? If I give that away, I give up everything. And this, I think, is really where the battle lines are going to be drawn, on how, whether it's companies like Streambed or initiatives like the Deep Trust Alliance, how do we get to break open these systems and free up the data? Because ultimately that is the core point. That's the currency of this particular economy. And what I get frustrated by is how little sophistication there is around this conversation. That particular issue of data. We know that there's this concerns about privacy, and we know about disinformation, and we know about identity theft, and we know all about the abuses of the system. We know all about Cambridge Analytica, but there's very little deep comprehension, at least to me, or deep conversation around the business model itself. And so we get this kind of two sides of our mouth contradiction where the platforms are being told, all right, we want you to be a censor on this particular issue, where you have to shut down this lie, that lie, this hate speech, whatever. But you know what? You're a platform, which means that you can step back and have no responsibility for what's on there at the same time. And there's that contradiction is kind of captured in law. It's a really difficult situation. But at the end of the day, I think you're right. It comes down to what does society want, and do we have the right conversation underway to set these terms? I hope that technology finds a solution to it. We're certainly working on it. You're working on it. But I think there's a big policy conversation to have as well. What do you? I mean, it looks like here we are. We're down to 60 seconds. So I wanted to go there and see what you think is going to happen on the policy front, but it looks like we're running out of time. What I've got to ask you then, Kathryn, is your futurist prediction. Final question: what will the future look like by 2021 when the next futurist conference comes along?
Well, I'll answer that perspective. I think there's still a huge lack of understanding of those technology business models in Washington and other government capitals. And so I think there's going to be a lot of noise and a lot of hearings about big tech and about its role in media, elections, information. I think there'll be very little tangible movement, either from the platforms or from governments from a policy perspective.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think there'll be a lot more noise about this. I think there'll be an awareness of it. I'd like to say there won't be a major crisis created by some deep fake at some point, but it's something to keep your eye out for, I think, as a warning. I'm guessing that we're still going. Oh, this is probably my answer. I'm sorry, guys. I'm not following the rules here. This is probably my answer. So what do you think the actual future looks like with regards to all this? Yeah, I tend to agree with Kathryn. I think there's going to be a greater conversation about this. There'll be some greater level of awareness. I do think that there will be new tools out there that will unlock data for people that outside of these platforms. There will also be new tools that will come out of organizations like yours that will start to give people the capacity to make serious judgments about the provenance of digital media. I think we're going to get to this point where the question of digital media provenance is going to be a major talking point, and something that we start to understand and therefore look for solutions and tools to address. So that's it. I think I'm rounding up now, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry, guys, I'm not making sure this is clear.
Thanks, Michael. This has been great.
Thank you, Kathryn. It was a pleasure. Let's maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Absolutely.
All right.